now we have to talk about the debate over where the crossing of the Red Sea was. So some people think that the crossing point could have been at one of those lakes in the Nile's upper or northern delta region. And other people think that it might have been at the ends of one of those two gulfs that go around the Sinai Peninsula, the Suez and Aqaba, that maybe they crossed like right near the tips of either one. But the problem with all of those options is that if you were chasing them and they went to one of those bodies of water and it split apart into two pieces and they went through, you would not follow them into that, especially when it's such an easy thing to just go around. Like I said, I used to run long distance, and going around any of those is child's play. I mean, you just go right around. And the Egyptians all had horses, so again, they could have sent at least part of their troops around. And on a horse, you're going to be around in a flash, because a horse is built to run. And so this idea that this huge body of water would just split apart into two pieces, two walls, as they said. They said that they could see the walls of the ocean on either side, which basically would have looked like a gargantuan wave, like Interstellar, just sitting there frozen on either side of you. Or like the wave, those massive waves at Nazaré, Portugal, but even bigger and just like sitting there frozen in suspension. That would be one of the most unnerving things you had ever seen in your life, to just see these huge walls of ocean sitting there like that. And it also says that their path was cut off, the Egyptians, their path was cut off by a massive column of clouds, which was actually a tornado, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So a massive tornado came and got right in their face. And of course, tornadoes are really loud and freaky, so you just have this gargantuan, like, screaming tornado that comes and gets right in their face, while behind it, the ocean is just crushed apart into two halves. And they're, the Hebrews are like escaping down into it, going, down into the ocean. You would not just sit there, especially with all that adrenaline in your system, and just twiddle your thumbs if it was at the lakes or the top of one of those two gulfs. You would just go around. It's that simple. And I could talk a lot more about that, but that's the basic idea. So none of those upper, geographically upper, more northern options make any sense. And none of those are 220 miles away or even close to that. So that leaves only two other options. You've got those two gulfs on either side of the Sinai Peninsula. So it's like a giant V shape. And the gulf on the right, on the east side, is the Gulf of Aqaba. And so the only other two options left for where they could have crossed the Red Sea were in the middle of the Gulf of Aqaba or at the bottom. And in order to have gone across the middle part of the Gulf of Aqaba at the Nuweiba Beach crossing, the ocean would have needed to have gone down over a half a mile deep, nearly a kilometer, like massively deep into the earth, and they would have needed to walk down a half a mile into the earth and then back up. It would have been worse than like the Grand Canyon. And the phenomenon that I'm about to tell you about in a minute, that's a really weird side effect of extreme seismic activity, it can split a body of water like the ocean apart to that depth, but not without churning that area into the surface of Venus while it's doing it. And so it doesn't make sense that phenomenon I'm about to tell you about would have split the ocean at Nuweiba Beach. The only way it could have split the ocean at Nuweiba Beach is if, like, just blatant open magic was being used by, the higher dimensions, and and it was just totally obvious that just clear, naked sorcery was being used to hold the ocean back. And a lot of people think that makes sense because they think that what God was trying to do was to like just show them that he was real and show them like, hey, look, I have magical power. Look at that. And but that doesn't make sense. And there's 3 reasons why the Nueva Beach crossing doesn't make any sense, and why using open magic is not what happened. The first reason is that human beings, our psychology is not that stable. Like, in order to just fly into space on a space mission, you have to be like heavily vetted through this stringent process in, you know, NASA and all these other organizations, and you couldn't just show human beings like a gargantuan example of undeniable magic and think that that would go well. That would break our brains. Like, we have enough trouble as it is, even with the world around us still being very consistent. Like, we still don't handle that well. So you can't introduce in, like, the rules don't matter anymore. Just, you know, break the matrix in front of everybody. Like, most people cannot cope with that. Like, if a giant face came down in the sky and just started talking, or, you know, something really obvious like that, like the ocean split and the walls were just like perfectly flat, you know, like unnaturally flat looking, instead of like a wave, you know, just like totally straight, and you saw stuff like that, then you wouldn't be able to live the rest of your life well. You would constantly be wondering if the things that were happening around you were like real natural laws, or is magic being used? Did I really misplace my keys, or has a fairy made them disappear? Or, you know, like it would just drive you insane, and it's like our minds cannot handle things like that. And that's kind of like the short version of it. But so that's one reason of part 1 why you can't do that. Another reason is that if a higher dimension were to like reveal its existence so undeniably like that, the Hebrew people would, it would remove all plausible deniability, and everyone would just be like, okay, God exists. Like, people wouldn't even debate it. And they wouldn't have questioned Moses. They wouldn't have rebelled 1,000,000 times. And they would have just been good the whole time. And that's the exact opposite of what happened. They were just constantly rebelling, constantly doing the wrong thing, just acting like a bunch of people were acting like wild animals with rabies, and just it is complaining throughout the entire Exodus, even like over 40 years, even to the very end of the Exodus. The next generation had like learned complaining from their parents, and even they were complaining to Moses at the very end. And so like it was just constant disrespect for Moses. And the only reason that could happen is because there was plausible deniability that he really was the messenger to help them. And so that's another huge giveaway, that all the miracles that happen were all done with plausible deniability, to where it really was a miracle, but then you could question it. You could be like, well, maybe that was just some freak natural occurrence, you know? Like, everything had a natural look and feel to it. It wasn't flat walls of the ocean, you know, totally straight, and you could like see in, and like a whale's like waving to you and stuff. Nah, it wasn't like that. It looked natural. So that's the first reason why open magic doesn't make sense. The second reason is that if you're going to use just undeniable, obvious, preternatural, metaphysical magic in front of God and everybody, why would you split the ocean apart and make them walk down into it a half a mile and then all the way back up with their carts and old ladies and kids and stuff? Like, why would you do that? That's so bizarre, especially if the point was to like prove to them that you were real and you had super magic powers. Because if you by splitting the ocean like that, you just left it open for all future generations to deny it and to be like, well, maybe it was actually the tides that went down or something. If the point was to be like, look, here I am, and I have power over everything, even the nature of reality, then you wouldn't have. There's like a million better things you could have done. Like you could have raised the ocean floor up above the sea level so they could just walk across the top. You could have given them magic Jesus shoes so they could just walk over the water. You could have given them, wings on their feet like Hermes so they could just fly across. You could have made a rainbow bridge like Thor so they could just walk over the bridge. Like there's a million things you could have done that would have been super cool and would have made it obvious that you had power over everything. You wouldn't make them walk down into the earth a half a mile over the sea floor. Like that doesn't make any sense. So that's the second reason why that whole idea doesn't make sense. Now the third reason, and this is the death knell of the idea that they would have crossed at Nueva Beach. The third reason is that the Jordan River, when they went to cross the Jordan River, the story says that the water that was flowing downstream just suddenly stopped and froze in place, and then a perfectly straight hallway opened up down the middle with perfectly flat sides on it, and it was all just frozen. Oh wait, it doesn't say that, sorry. What it does say is that the upstream side got pushed back so far back that it went all the way to the next town, and it started like piling up. And then the downstream side ran completely dry. And subtext there, it got pushed completely dry as well. So downstream, totally dry. Upstream, being backed up like an invisible dam is holding it, and it's piling up because of the flow of water. That is a completely naturalistic phenomenon. They didn't say it froze and it made a perfectly straight hallway through the river. They described an entirely organic type phenomenon, and that was the clue in the Torah in all of these events of how it is that they crossed the Red Sea. It was the same mechanism in both instances. And so if something has a naturalistic look and feel to it, it can't split the ocean down a half a mile deep without churning it into a sterilized radiation zone that no one would be walking through. If you're using a naturalistic phenomenon, the crossing has to be at a shallower location. So that's the three reasons why the Nueva Beach crossing idea makes no sense at all, and it was not where they crossed. So that only leaves one other option, which is at the very, very bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba at the Straits of Tiran. At the Straits of Tiran, there's a land bridge underneath the water, like a giant ford. And it's down about the depth of a skyscraper, a high-rise building. And the phenomenon I'm going to tell you about can split the ocean apart to that depth and still leave a habitable zone in the middle for people to walk through that wouldn't fry everyone to death. And it also just so happens that the Straits of Tiran are exactly 220 miles away from where they left in Egypt. So it's all triangulated together to show you what happened. And so now I have to tell you how the ocean was split. And that will also give away how they were guided to the location of where to cross. Oh, and another thing, hearkening back to what I said earlier, the Straits of Tiran, down at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, at the very tip there, are a straight shot right down the western coast. You just go right down that western coast of the Sinai Peninsula, and it takes you to the Straits of Tiran. You actually have to like go to the very tip and then turn around and go back up the east side just a little bit. But, you know, for all intents and purposes, it's down there near the tip. And so if you told someone we camped here and then we camped here, then that tells them everything they need to know. Okay, then you went from here all the way down to here in a straight line. So that's part of why it only lists 2 camping sites. So I guess now I have to tell you how the ocean was split. So whenever you have a just gargantuan amount of seismic activity and upheaval and turmoil inside the earth, it's disrupting the flow of the magma within the mantle. And that flow of the magma within the mantle, within all of the Earth's interior, where it occupies, that's what is creating the magnetic field of Earth. And so the flow of the magma and the movement of the inner Earth things are intimately linked with our magnetic field. So if you have massive seismic activity, you're disrupting that flow within the Earth. And when you disrupt the flow, you're disrupting the magnetic field, you know, due to the dynamo effect. And when you disrupt the magnetic field above a particular location of Earth, one of the things it'll cause is it'll create at least one gigantic hole in the magnetic field. So you'll basically have like another pole opening up above that location, and then that'll just be funneling in a huge amount of solar and cosmic radiation, or charged particles, like the solar wind and the cosmic rays. Just these like highly charged particles just blasting through the universe, and then, you know, especially from the sun. And then that stuff gets funneled in and concentrated into that hole up there. And then it's like taking the entire aurora and then just squeezing that into, you know, that huge ring around the top and bottom of the Earth, and just taking that entire thing and squeezing it all into one single little point. And then it just becomes excruciatingly intense, sort of like a magnifying glass. And then you have this like just powerful burst of energy coming down through the atmosphere, and it's over 100 miles high. And as it's burning down through the atmosphere, it's actually producing a faint red glow that you could see at night. So you end up with this towering red column of light coming down all the way through the atmosphere. And this is over 100 miles high. So this thing is massive. And so you can see it from a very far way away. And it's basically like following a star, or like the North Star or something, where it's just stationary and you can see it from an extreme distance. And so all you have to do is just follow it. And at 220 miles away over the curvature of the Earth, something only needs to be about 6 miles up for you to be able to see it in the sky just above the horizon. And with mountains and all that, factor rounded up to maybe 10 miles high. Well, this thing is like 100 plus miles high into the atmosphere, so they could definitely see it all the way up there in Egypt. And so that's how they were guided to the location of the Red Sea crossing. This thing was actually sitting directly over the Straits of Tiran during the whole first part of the Exodus. And so if you're in Egypt and you see this huge column of like glowing red in the sky every night, and you just start walking straight towards it, and it's at the Straits of Tiran, then there's nothing to think about. It just guides you straight down the western coast of the Sinai Peninsula. And this is interesting too, because it adds another dimension to how unnerving these plagues would have been for the Egyptian people, that, you know, it wasn't just Moses saying we need to go out into the desert and worship our God. It was Moses pointing and saying we need to go out into the desert and worship our God. That's him right there. And so that just adds another layer of allure, I guess, or mystique to this whole the eeriness of this period for them in Egypt. So they leave Egypt, they start going down the western coast of the Sinai Peninsula, and they're following the column the entire way, just like it says in the Torah. They followed the column of fire, and not like people have imagined it like it was some like burning like mass of fire in the sky right in front of them, and it was just like moving along. No, it was sitting in one spot, but it was just so big that like it was easy to follow. You know, again, like celestial navigation and stuff. But so they go down the western coast of the Sinai Peninsula, and the Straits of Tiran, like I said, they're not at the very tip, they're actually slightly back up on the other side. So in order to get there, there's a bunch of mountains all along here, so you can't just go through the Sinai Peninsula. Like there's only specific places where you can go inland because of all these mountains and stuff. And so you like once you got down to the parallel opposite side of where the Straits of Tiran were, you couldn't just go straight across and be there. You had to keep going all the way down to the tip and then turn around and then start coming back up the other side. Like you had to do that V shape. And so as they were going, the column of fire in the sky that had been in front of them the whole time would have started to, once they were getting close, it would have moved to the side of them like that because it was on the other side of the mountains over there. But they couldn't just go straight to it. Like they had to keep going down to the tip first. And in order to do that, like as they were doing that, it was actually moving back behind them a little bit. So once they got to the tip, they churned around and started coming back up the other side. And then they churned back in the direction of the column of fire and started going towards it again. And that's why it says in the Torah that before that final campsite, or that, second campsite that it mentions, they had to turn around and go back. That's why it's saying that. It's not just that they were churning around and going back in the other direction. It was that they were churning around and going back towards the column of fire again, because they had, walked to the point where it was like behind them somewhat. And people have always sort of scratched their head about that detail of why does it say they had to churn back? What are they talking about? But that's what they were talking about. And this is an interesting point because once they churned around and started coming back, there was actually, as they were like going back towards the Straits of Tiran, there was actually this massive canopy of clouds surrounding that whole region, because this column of fire that was coming down was actually bringing heat down, heat and pressure and wind, and it was pushing a whole bunch of hot, warm, moist air out from the center, from that epicenter there, and then that hot, warm air wants to go back up, and so it was going back up, and it was creating these massive clouds all throughout this area. So as they were going back up the east coast, they would have walked underneath that huge canopy of clouds, and it would have been a lot more dark down there with like sort of like a somber gray, bluish hue casting down. And as they got closer and closer to that hole in the center of the clouds where that column of fire was coming down, they would have gotten more and more of that like soft, glowing red, like just painting everything. And so it would have had this like eerie sort of tone to it all, with that like crimson light on everything, like sort of contrasted with the blue light of what was coming through the clouds. And so it would have been some of the craziest lighting ever. And it would have been confusing. They would have probably lost track of, what time it was and day and night. And because you couldn't, it was like dark and you just had this like red glow coming from the center there. So as I mentioned, there was hot, warm air, moist air trying to go back up as hot air does. And whenever you have a mass of air of higher pressure and there's another, parcel of air in its way, and you have one part, region of air that wants to go from here to here, but there's this other like cooler, lower pressure air blocking it. They can't just trade places. It'll have to like find a channel through and then just start flowing in through that channel to the other side of that air above it. And whenever you have a bunch of fluid all flowing towards a single channel like that, it of course starts to spin as it does. And then you end up with this massive whirlwind that just takes on a life of its own. And then just like the momentum just keeps building and building and building. And then that can just kind of like move around and stuff. And so that's how you get that's how you get tornadoes. And like, water spouts on the ocean and cyclones, as they say in some places. But so it wasn't just that there were clouds up there. It was that the clouds were being fed by these massive tornadoes in the area. And there would have always been at least one in the area, like one massive tornado. And so it wasn't just that, there was like this, spooky red-blue contrast of glow all around them. It was also that there was a gigantic tornado way out there over the ocean. And that tornado would have been being bathed in that red glow from that central column. So they would have seen this massive tornado that was painted red, essentially. And so that's why they described it as, they said the Lord was out in front of us in a column of clouds and a column of fire. And that's why they said it was like fires, because it was being painted red, essentially. And then they said it like moved back around slowly and eventually went behind them to where when the Egyptians finally did catch up, that tornado was just sitting there behind them, behind the Hebrews, and preventing the Egyptians from being able to come any closer. And that tornado just sat there the whole time to give them time to get away. But there was nowhere to get away to, because if you're camped on the Sinai Peninsula side of the Straits of Tiran there's nowhere to go. It's basically a dead end. You're trapped. And so this is where, famously in the story, the ocean splits apart. And the way that this happened, this breach, by the way, through the Earth's magnetic field like this, these anomalous breaches that only happen tens of thousands of years apart, if even that, these are known as geomagnetic excursion events. And whenever you have a geomagnetic excursion event creating a column of fire like this down through the atmosphere, this like burning plasma, essentially, it's creating a bunch of heat and pressure in the atmosphere, and then that heat and pressure is pushing out and expanding, and it's pushing down in like this cascade effect going all the way down. And so you essentially have a tidal wave of pressure coming down every single day around, like late morning, from that solar wind, that really intense solar wind hitting that hole more directly. And then you have that like intense like heating effect that's going further and further down through the atmosphere, and the pressure is pushing out ahead of it. So it's like a giant tidal wave of pressure pushing down through the atmosphere. And then when it finally gets to the ocean, it just comes smashing into the ocean and just crushes it apart. So it's this like intense pressure, and then that it crushes into the ocean, pushes it down and out, and then this is causing a bunch of massive winds to go out, and then the wind is like dragging it out even more dramatically at the same time, and it literally is crushing into the ocean like a meteor impact, but of air. It's like a meteor of air smashing into the ocean and pressing it out. And it literally is creating like a giant like meteor crater in the ocean, like a big circular crater in the ocean. So that's why they said they could see the walls of the ocean around them. The walls they were seeing were like the walls of a meteor crater, but instead of earth, it was water. It was a crater of water. And so it just crushed it down to about the depth of a high-rise building into the ocean, and it exposed that underwater land bridge that goes across the Straits of Tiran, which in their day was a continuous bridge underwater, and then all that wind dried the ground out, like they mentioned in the Torah, and then they just went down into it about the depth of a skyscraper, which is not a bad depth to walk down over a distance, and they went through this gigantic crater in the ocean, and they passed underneath the column in the middle, the column of red glowing fire coming down. So they were in this huge crater, and it was all red. And they just went through the crater, and the tornado was just sitting there the whole time, like holding the Egyptians back and giving them time to cross. And so this is why the Egyptians were waiting there, just waiting behind that tornado. It was because there was nowhere else to go. Like, there was literally no other option. They had to just sit and wait while this tornado was blocking their path off. And it would have looked freaky to them because they would have been on the backside of the tornado. So to them, it would have looked like a black tornado with just like a red highlight around the outside. So just like this red wreathed black tornado, which would have looked pretty disturbing from their perspective. And it was just sitting there, just being a tornado. But so then they get through, and then the tornado moves, and the tornado was there for hours, and then it moves out of the way, and then having no other option, they try to follow them into the sea. And so they go down in there, and once they went down into the ocean, they got about halfway through, and then they just started to panic. And it even says that God was looking down on them through the column of fire. And so when they said God was looking down on them through the column of fire, they meant literally down through the column of fire, because they were trying to pass through it too. So they were directly under the center of that geostorm where that plasma light was coming down. And so that's why they worded it that way, looking down on them through the column of fire, not out of the column of fire, through the column of fire. So, and then they started to like freak out and panic, and like the wheels started falling off of their chariots, and they were just like, it was just too insane for them, and they panicked, and then they turned around and tried to run back or try to go back. And because at this point they were like, this is just too freaky, this is just too disturbing, and now the wheels are falling off of our chariots, like we're up against something that's just too horrifying. So they turned around and went back, which is a natural instinct of, trying to go down into an ocean crater, because it's like it's waves sitting in suspension, essentially, like gargantuan waves just sitting there frozen from your perspective. So you don't know if they're going to keep sitting there or if they're going to collapse in on you. Like, that's absolutely terrifying. So you would only go through it if you absolutely had no other choice. And but when the Egyptians went down, they just, like, it was just too much, and they freaked out and went back. And this is an interesting point. Well, they tried to go back. The crater released, the pressure released, and the crater just imploded back in on them. And it wasn't from side to side like two walls smashing together. It was in a circle from all around, just crushing back in towards an epicenter and just sending up like the most massive fountain you've ever seen in your life, just at the center. And it just crushed them back and mixed it all together. And that would have been a wild way to go. So this brings up an interesting point, because now they've gotten to freedom. Now they realize they actually did get out of Egypt with all the wealth of Egypt, and now there's no military to even come pursue them anymore. So they just won the lottery. So they were on cloud nine. They were just like super excited and happy, and they threw this huge party and started, dancing and singing and stuff. And this brings up an interesting point, because when it says that the wheels were falling off their chariots, it's obviously telling us that they had chariots. But a scholar would question my assertions, because that would place, because I've stated that the Torah through science dates itself to a couple centuries earlier, but when you move back a couple centuries, it brings you to a time in Egyptian history where, for all we know, they didn't have chariots yet. So it's believed that they did not have chariot technology at this time. But here's the thing. Just because we haven't found the evidence of it, obviously doesn't mean that they didn't have it. It just means we haven't found the evidence that they had chariots yet. And their neighbors, the Hyksos, further up the Levant, did have chariots. They had highly functional chariots. And these ancient civilizations were always keeping tabs on one another and, like spying on one another and stuff. So there's no way they didn't know about chariots. What realistically would have happened is that they would have already found out about chariots by seeing what the Hyksos had and how well they worked, and then they would have started to try and make them themselves. But since it was such a new thing for them, like technology takes time to work the bugs out on. There's a lot of research and development. It takes a while. A lot of trial and error, and so you don't make the coolest chariot overnight just because you saw one. Like, you have to figure it out. It's like, how companies will protect their secret sauce for how they figured out how to do something, because it was such a hard and difficult task for them to figure out how to do it. It's like their secret formula, but proprietary information. So the Egyptians realistically, by all rights, should have had chariots, but they were probably very, very new to them, and only kind of not super well made yet. And that would explain why the wheels were falling off in the ocean, because if a chariot has been made properly, it won't have its wheels falling off under any circumstances. Like, you could throw the thing off a cliff. It'll split into splinters before the wheels will come off. And so that's a clue that the chariots that they had were not really that well developed yet. And Egypt would not have been bragging about their chariots before they knew they were actually that good of a tool. Before they had done something really amazing that they could brag about. It would have just been, a project that was being worked on, not something that they were, going to chisel into the record, like, look at this thing. They weren't there yet. And so that is more than likely, realistically, that would be why, one, we don't see records yet of them having chariots, and two, why at that earlier date, the wheels would be popping off. So, anyway. And again, if the Hyksos had chariots, they would have known about chariots. Like, you can't tell me they wouldn't have known about it. But anyway, so there it is. They made it through the Red Sea crossing, and they were free and had a ton of wealth and money. And it even mentions this in the Ippawar Papyrus. It mentions all of the plagues of Egypt, and even that last part that, this is in the Egyptian record of what happened, where it mentions that last part where they were told to borrow all the jewelry and gold and garments from their hosts, so that they could take it out to worship their god. The Ippawar Papyrus says the world is upside down and servants are wearing the garments of their masters. So it even mentions that little detail there. And a garment back in the day was basically like a car, like an expensive car. It took a lot of wealth and money to put a really nice garment together for a wealthy person. So that would have been a big deal. But there you have it. They make it out of Egypt, and their journey in the desert has only begun.